You're listening to the Talent Therapy Podcast. Here, you'll find discussions around recruiting trends and best practices with talent acquisition leaders in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries so that you and your team are informed and up to date in an ever-evolving space. And now, here's your host, Chris Tamburini.
All right, Miss Amy Akillian, welcome to the Talent Therapy Podcast. How are you today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. It'd be great if you could introduce yourself to the listeners and give them kind of a background on who you are and what your perspective is when it comes to talent acquisition.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I am an avid listener and very, very excited. So I am a talent advisor, mostly to life sciences organizations, also technology. I've been doing this for about 25 years, the last 17 of which have been predominantly life sciences. But I have an interesting path because I grew up as an internal practitioner within some small and even larger biotech and pharmaceutical companies. I've brought that experience to bear on the consulting side now for the last 6 years or so. So I'm really excited to give a little bit of perspective on my view from the wall, so to speak, about what we are all challenged with in our market.
That's great. 25 years. That's no short stint. Sometimes people have short stints in TA, but you have been obviously a lifer, and you've probably seen a ton change over the last 2.5 decades.
Yeah. I mean, and acutely in the last 5 or 6 years, I think that evolution in the talent space is always around us. However, since COVID, post-COVID, the world has really changed. We live in an interesting world at the moment, and so what I've noticed, even in the last 18 to 24 months, is the real need to evolve quickly in how we think about talent, how we acquire talent, how we develop talent, really in any industry. And I think life sciences in particular evolves rapidly on its own. So when you put those two quickly paced things side by side, folks like you, folks like me, folks like the companies we work with are under a lot of pressure when they think about how to build their organizations.
Yeah. Let's use that as a kind of umbrella, because I want to go back to that general concept that you just mentioned. But I really would like to start off with you and have the listeners understand. And I actually want to know personally, because I don't know this, even though I've known you for a little while, I don't actually know how you got into talent acquisition in the first place. So 25 years ago. So bring us back to the late 1990s, if my math is correct.
Your math is very good. Yes. So I was a full-time college student nearing the end of my college career and took a job with a startup technology company. This is during the dot-com era. And was working sort of part-time as an office administrator. And I remember looking around my desk, and it was 5 C-level executives and me because the company was growing. And all I saw piled around me were resumes. And, I would ask the CEO or the CFO, what are you doing with all these resumes? And how are you bringing people into the organization, and how can I help? So I sort of became the maidenhead of all talent that was trying to be interviewed during a very chaotic and fast-paced time, and really fell in love with dealing with people and understanding what motivates people to want to join an organization and representing the qualities the company had that would attract talent. And from there, I've always been a learner. And so I sort of surrounded myself we worked with some external partners. I learned a lot from the candidates that I dealt with, and fell in love with helping to bricklay an organization and help the company be ready to bring people on board and help them grow. Fast forwarding just a bit, I think for me, I've always been very purpose driven. So I had my eye on the life sciences market for a very long time. And after helping build 2 tech companies, decided to make my way into consulting with a radio diagnostics company. And again, help them build sort of from a very small number to a good sized number, and really learn the drug development continuum. So recruiting was my first love. It will always have a big place in my heart. I love dealing with candidates. But I very quickly understood that in the talent ecosystem, there are a lot of moving pieces, acquisition being one of them, but understanding the strategic roadmap, understanding infrastructure and operations and technology, understanding branding, right? What are the things you need to be saying to the talent market? And then understanding how to build a culture internally that's really inclusive of everybody. So I would say now I operate in the talent ecosystem versus talent acquisition specifically.
All right. All right. We talked about the evolution of talent acquisition, which obviously includes technology applications. And we have recently come up upon AI and how that's going to affect the talent ecosystem or talent acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And I would be curious to hear what you've seen from an evolution standpoint from when you started 25
Mm-hmm.
years ago to where we are now. I know that in my 17 years, have seen a few things significantly impact recruiting from a technology standpoint, but you've seen more. And so I want to talk about that from your perspective, what you've seen from an evolutionary angle, and then
Mm-hmm.
also, more interestingly, where you and I see that going and incorporating AI and how much AI is really going to change, or maybe it's not going to change things that we do. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah,
Loaded
absolutely.
question.
Well,
I gave you a big one.
no, 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 it's a great question. It's top of mind for me all the time. I know coming out of LEAP, the last LEAP conference on the West Coast, AI was noted as the biggest and most powerful upcoming kind of move for our industry, in that it is meant to help companies work faster and smarter. And really, I think in my mind, the place for AI, having a personal experience is very important for candidates. So I don't think it will ever replace that, nor would I recommend it replaces it. However, what I think AI does really well is take on a lot of the administrative burden that lands on recruiters,
Right.
and allows them to elevate and become more strategic partners, to the business because of that lift being taken off of them. So that's number one. You asked what I've noticed over the years, the last 25 years, and um, you're going to laugh, but when I first started recruiting, I had my prized possession on my desk was my letter opener because people were mailing their resumes in. And I fought with the fax machine every day because it would eat half of a resume I was trying to pull through. So from a technology perspective, it's like a quantum leap. I feel like I've been alive in two lifetimes during recruitment. But everything from really thinking about how to leverage applicant tracking systems and CRMs to thinking about really powerful search engine optimizations and what your candidate experience is like through your portal, creating talent communities and engagement models. And so I think those have all been incremental improvements over the years that I think built nicely on top of each other. I think AI really turns a lot of that on its head, right? Because we're not on its head necessarily, but it is such a leap through automation and machine learning and systems that are significantly smarter and faster than a lot of us in the way that they categorize and think about information, that it is really creating a need for a shift for people that do talent acquisition on the inside, and for leaders of those groups of people to think about who is the person you need in the role that can best leverage things like AI and also support the business as a partner.
Yeah. I mean, you look at, I want to talk about AI more like in depth and like some technical or like practical applications of it. But all the things you mentioned, right? You started off using faxes and then you kind of saw the evolution of ATSs, which by the way, I think some of those systems were really clunky. When I
Yeah.
started, I remember being on my end trying to upload information, and I also remember being a job applicant when I was in college, putting information into these things, and they weren't very user friendly. And I don't even know
No.
how effective they were, and I don't even know on the talent acquisition side how much they got out of it. Maybe they obviously got something out of it, but you look at
Right.
some of the newer technologies that are out there, and you can just tell how much they've streamlined those things and how much easier they are to use, and some of the automation aspects that they've built into that to make things look and flow really nicely. And that's, certainly night and day from a fax machine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, exactly. And I also think I spent a good chunk of my career working in operations, so talent operations. And what I learned through that experience is that your process should really inform the way your applicant tracking system works, not the other way around.
Right.
And what I mean by that is a number of times I've worked with companies that bought an applicant tracking system, and even the very best systems, and by best I mean user friendly, intuitive, etc., are usually sold off the shelf, right? You implement it best you can, or you have a team that comes in to help you. But if your system is what's driving your process, then what you're not capturing is what's important to your organization and how your team likes to work, right? So, are your hiring managers in the system and driving candidate review and progress, or is it your talent acquisition team that's doing that? For one. Things like data and analytics. I am an absolute data dork, I'll call myself, but I could look at data all day. But I think it's one of the most powerful tools for us to understand how we're doing. Are things working the way they're supposed to? I think applicant tracking systems have taken us light years forward in terms of understanding diversity and inclusion. Are we doing what we need to as an organization to attract the right talent across a spectrum of candidates, so that at the end of the day, if we have diversity goals as an organization, we know whether or not we're meeting them. So I agree with you. I think even the best of the systems can be kludgy. I think if you don't lead with your process before your technology, it's very hard to have a fighting chance of using things the right way.
That actually is a perfect segue to the next topic, and actually kind of folds in really nicely. So you mentioned that when you're looking at technology, if I heard you correctly, it's more important to define the internal recruiting process or talent acquisition process first, whether that's led by talent acquisition or whether that's led by the hiring teams, or maybe it's a combination of both. I'd like to hear your take on that. And then leveraging technology to fit that particular process. And that also could be maybe where some of that AI comes in on how to customize that, because like you said, a lot of these systems are off the shelf, and while they're very effective, maybe they don't optimize your internal process. And I think that's probably the goal of any technology, is to optimize a process versus you being a slave to the process that's already been programmed. So when you talk about acquiring and retaining talent and putting a process together and then weaving in technology, I guess my first question is, part of acquiring and retaining talent is coming up with a really good process. So as a talent advisor, I'm sure you've seen a ton of different things and a ton of different philosophies, but what is your philosophy as an advisor to, number one, create a process, acquire and retain talent? And then my second part to that question would be, how do you see an ideal technology integration into that process?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great question. Okay, so I think first and foremost, any end-to-end recruiting process, and I would argue any end-to-end talent process, that's all the way from before somebody understands who you are as an organization that you're hiring, all the way through they're an employee, you're developing them, you're trying to retain them. That entire process, in my mind, is a very dynamic versus static process, right? It should be a living, breathing, changing process that evolves over time based on any number of things. Your business strategy changes, therefore your people strategy changes, market conditions change, your culture as an organization changes. You become a global versus a US based organization. That process needs to be agile and able to evolve.
Totally.
That's one. Two, I also believe that any good, and I'll air quote good, but any effective recruitment process needs to be built on a platform of positive experience. And that's candidate experience, that's hiring team experience, and that's really the talent functions or the HR functions experience, right? And so If you start with the end in mind, and that at the end of the day, you want everybody to have a positive experience, and build from there, you already have an intuitive process, right? And so I think that's, when sometimes I sit down with companies and they've identified they want to build a process, and they whip out a document with swim lanes and blocks and arrows and whatnot. My first question is, where did this come from? Is this a process you've used somewhere else that worked well and we're pulling it forward? Which is not the wrong answer. There are no wrong
Sure.
answers, right? But have we infused the things that matter at this company at this moment in time into this process? Let's start up here and then bring it down into what the steps need to be to support what's up here. I think technology comes in as a enablement tool. So technology is there to make sure you can do the things you have outlined are important through your recruitment process. And I think AI runs alongside but is separate from what's happening in your applicant tracking system, and I'll explain how. Your applicant tracking system is there to capture talent that is interested in the roles that you have posted. Those are largely, you've created some branding, you've advertised, and candidates say, oh, this looks interesting, this company looks interesting, I'd like to apply. It's also a repository for your recruiters who've sourced talent to put them into a system and keep them organized. What AI is very good at doing, in the experience I've had with it in the last couple of years, is helping you understand what the universe of talent looks like, whether or not they have any idea of who you are. It identifies those people as potential, we'll call them targets, a little bit of an aggressive word, but potential talent for your organization. And that enables your talent team to then go out to those people, right? So it's about reach. It's about capturing talent through one system. It's about identifying talent in the other. And then all roads kind of lead back to your applicant tracking system. And that's where your talent communities live. Does that make sense?
That makes great sense. That's a fantastic answer. Do you think, you mentioned right now that that AI is a great tool to look at the talent universe,
Mm-hmm.
which is obviously very vast and broad.
Mm.
I don't know if you've seen this, but I'm curious because you would have better access to this and line of sight to this than I would. Have you seen any AI technology that can simply take basic commands and go out and start finding ideal profiles on paper?
Mm-hmm.
Have you seen anything like that? I mean, I've seen automation that can do that. It's been doing it for years,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know that I've
Mm-hmm.
seen any AI that I can simply speak into a microphone or type out a little, chat GPT note and says, hey, find me a candidate with XYZ skill sets who's got 10 years experience, has been a director, lives on the West Coast of the United States, and has done volunteer work. Go for it. Like, have you seen that? I haven't seen that yet, but maybe it's being developed.
I have, and I use it every day. So I'll give you an example. The tool I use is called Nebula. And the reason I love using it is because, so we all use LinkedIn Recruiter, right? We all use LinkedIn as professionals,
Right.
as recruiters, as hiring managers, et cetera, which is super helpful, very powerful tool. However, you're limited to what lives within LinkedIn, right? It's only surveying what's within the LinkedIn community. Not everybody is in LinkedIn. Not
Right.
everybody pays attention to their LinkedIn, et cetera. The tool I use, Nebula, I could do exactly what you suggested. I need somebody with these skills in this part of the country, this much experience. Here are some really important, attributes I need this person to have. And it scours every single working person in the United States. So they don't have to be on LinkedIn. This is people that have reported what their jobs are on a census. This is, companies reporting censuses, et cetera. And the system is smarter than I am. And in really not just finding people, but also ranking them in order of relevance. It will show me compensation insights. It will say, is this person close? If I say yes, it will find me 10 more of them. So really what it allows me to do is reach people I probably never would have found. It provides, some contact information for them that they've made publicly available somewhere. This is not a privacy violation or what have you.
Right.
And it is able to be intuitive in helping me think about, yes, you said you need these 5 things. Here's what I'm seeing in the system. Help me validate whether this is right. And then it does more of the same. Does that make
It
sense?
makes great sense. I didn't realize that was a platform that existed.
Oh,
Nebula,
yeah.
it's called, huh?
Nebula.
I
Exactly.
expected something like that to be, developed and marketed, but maybe I just haven't had the time to look into it. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it is. I'll show you. I'll show you someday.
Yeah, no, I'd love to see it, and I'm sure there's going to be many like that come out, and there's going to be some sort of competition, obviously. But that's pretty exciting. Okay, let me switch gears for a second because I think we kind of dove into the AI section that we really wanted to discuss, and it's going to be an ongoing conversation. But from your perspective, as a talent advisor, as someone with 25 years of experience in the industry, and someone who has seen a variety of different things in our current market, how do you feel that companies are winning top talent, not just talent, but like really high end or really relevant talent to their particular mission? We'll call it relevant talent to their mission. How do you think companies are able to do that nowadays? Maybe incorporating some of the things we just spoke about, but maybe incorporating other things that we haven't spoken about.
Hmm.
I'd be curious to hear your take on that.
Sure. I think for a large part of my career in talent, compensation was king,
Mm,
and so wasn't the only thing, but it's sort of if you could offer somebody a competitive enough package, and then follow with the things that were important to them in terms of development, in terms of culture, etc., you had a high likelihood to be able to get that talent in the door. I do think COVID was a catalyst to change all of that, and that is not a novel thought. There are a lot of people talking about that, but it really, I think, for a large part of the community, reprioritized people's motivators for leaving. I think ethos is closer to the top of the list, and culture and belonging are really important. I think the flexibility to be trusted to do work, to do good work, but also balance things like family, and even self care, and time off to rest. I think we're all pretty fatigued from the last few years. Well over compensation. I think that's one of the biggest things I've discovered. Um, I really think from a people perspective, development is really important, right? Folks want to know, yes, I'm going to go from company A to company B, um, but but where is this company committing to taking me? Where is this company committed to investing in me? So even in organizations, I work with some very, very small companies that haven't yet had the opportunity to build a formal development track for, let's say, scientists as an example. Showing intent as an employer that you are committed to building those things out, you are committed to identifying opportunities for people to grow and take a chance, is also super important. And so it's actually heartening in a lot of ways to me to see people making values-based decisions on job changes over, I'm going to pay you $20,000 more than your last employer, because it shows me people really care about the work that they do.
yeah, that's something that we've talked about on this podcast before, and I think it's a conversation that's going to continue to occur. On the other end of that, how is that being messaged, right? How is that being messaged to the market? Because it's something that I think you have to walk a fine line on, right? Like if you overly tout that to the market, they might be like, well, this might not be genuine.
Right.
So I guess, but maybe you have to. I don't know. I'm just speculating. What's your take on how to brand that or employer brand that? And what's your general take on employer branding in general and how to maybe convey some of those values, if you will, on how to win that talent?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it does come down to authenticity. The talent market is a group of very, very smart people. And I think the companies that underestimate that really lose out in the end. I do think your employees are your strongest talent tool. And if you're doing right by the people that work internally and empowering them to evangelize and advocate for coming to join the team, that is the most powerful thing. I have a lot of clients I work with on talent branding, who lead with, in our case, the science, right? And the science is super important. Patients are super important, and that is all the most impactful information. However, alongside that, the ones that do the best job of really attracting talent share the vision for the organization, share the science and why it's interesting, but also have their employees share why are they there, what makes it special to be part of that organization, what does it meant not just for their peers in the organization for their career, but what has it meant to the patients that they work with, what has it meant to their families, right? What are the things the company's doing above and beyond, what's on your list of work to do for the day in the community? What's the company's commitment to diversity, and how has that really shown up? Not just words, but actions. So, I think when I think back to when I first started working in life sciences, a lot of the talent branding was brand specific, right? This is our brand. We want you to recognize our colors and our logo, and we dominate this therapeutic area. This is what our revenue looks like. So you should feel confident in coming to work here. I hear very little of that these days. I hear a lot more related to ethos.
Yeah, I feel like what you just mentioned reminds me of like, Budweiser, like Coca-Cola, where just kind of like
Yes.
you're building a brand, people are going to
Yeah.
recognize it, people are going to feel comfortable with it, and for that
Right.
reason. But that's really hard to do when you have so many
Right.
small, especially in the biotech market where there's thousands of small to mid-sized companies. It's almost
Yeah.
impossible
Right.
unless you become a massive conglomerate, like a one of these large pharma companies. Then
Right.
that approach is kind of moot. And I think,
Yeah. Do you want to be one of those brands, right? You
yeah,
probably don't if you're operating as a mid cap biotech. And I'll give a specific example. I've got a client that I've worked with for a number of years on a bunch of different things. And very recently, they on their own, I did not do this body work with them, created a video that highlighted the people of their organization. And I got the opportunity to take a look at it. And I had goosebumps on my arms because I know a lot of the people inside the organization from working with them. And the way the video captured exactly what it's like, to work within that organization was unbelievable. And so what that brought back to me, even in thinking about how I help counsel companies on thinking about branding, is it is not about how it looks, how it sounds. It's really about how it feels. So if I'm a candidate and I'm watching that video and I'm watching, other content from other employers, what's going to bring me back is what was that company that made me feel a certain way? Oh, it was this company, right? And so it's about creating that feeling versus showing somebody something that they can memorize and understand.
yeah, that reminds me of some quote. I'm probably going to butcher the quote, but the quote is something along the lines of, when you pass away, no one's going to
Mm-hmm.
remember what you did. They're only going to remember how you made them feel. And so
Right.
I think that's a kind of a similar concept
100%.
of
Exactly.
what you're talking about. That's pretty cool. That's great. So when you this is related to, I think, you know, a topic that you and I discussed, competitive talent insights across the market. We're obviously in a different market right now, and that market I think is changing for the better. But what do you see right now from like a competitive standpoint on who's winning the talent battle when it comes to getting the best talent? And we already kind of talked about how maybe they're doing that, but what's your general take on what the competition landscape looks like?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think by virtue of being a consultant, I get a very unique position kind of on the wall looking across the market. I may not even work with a lot of the organizations, but I am able to watch for trends. And I know the trends and the insights I have can be really helpful for my clients, especially the very thoughtful clients that are trying to understand where they're positioned in their market, and leading with that as part of their people strategy. So what I would say is, um, I think years ago, the way recruitment worked in a lot of organizations I either worked in or worked with was, companies would put their headcount together, in the year prior, open their headcount on January 1st. They knew what was sort of planned for that calendar year or that fiscal year, and then they would just deal with the surprises. as they came. And I think it left a lot of talent teams on their heels a bit, right? Because it was not as much of a partnership with understanding what the market would bear that year, or trying to understand what other companies were doing. I see a lot more thoughtfulness and companies really working as diagnosticians to understand both what they can anticipate and also what the market might bring before they ever start headcount planning, or they're infusing it into their headcount planning process. So thinking about things not just of, all of these functions need all of these people, but thinking about things like criticality of a position, right? How important is it to have that role now? How critical? And urgency. It may be critical, but do you need it in Q1 or do you need it in Q3, right? And helping to be, work smarter, not harder, if you will, and avoiding some of the pitfalls that can come up. So I think that's the biggest trend, I guess I'll call out, is companies being very thoughtful about people planning. I think the second is, and it seems a little antithetical, but I've seen a lot of companies pull back on the compensation wars. Companies would just throw more money here, throw more money there to try and win people back and forth from each other.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of them have collectively pulled off the gas a bit to say, wait a minute, this is just going to create a massive inflation problem that none of us can ever get over. How do we stand our ground on fair compensation and competitive compensation, but really focus on those other things we've been talking about in terms of what attracts good talent for the right reasons?
Yeah, that's interesting. The compensation piece is interesting. I think you brought that up a couple of times, and how that used to be compensation is king. And now, compensation, I think, is prerequisite in a lot of ways, but it's not the end all be all.
Right.
I think biotech is privileged in a way to be in a high compensation field where people have, years of education and years of experience, and they're going to be compensated very well. But to your point, since that piece is kind of taken care of, it becomes almost a muted factor when competing with another organization for talent.
Right. And I think, the leadership teams I work with have gotten also very good at being, leading with transparency and helping their employee populations understand, look, we've got a cash runway to extend us from here to this next event, right? Our goal is to get from point A to point B, but our North Star is, let's say, commercialization over here. In order to do that, we have to make sure we're making smart choices. Making smart choices means paying fairly, but not blowing the bank on people, because if we do that, we won't be here long enough to commercialize. In that example. And so I think, again, going back to the whole thing of authenticity, the folks in our industry, again, are smart people and they care. So if they feel they're being fairly compensated and they understand the company's vision and they're bought into that vision and working collectively in service of that vision, then I think those conversations are a lot easier and well taken.
Absolutely. Very cool. What else is on your mind? Any other burning topics? I mean, I think we actually covered a lot of what we wanted to cover really efficiently.
We did. Yeah, no, we did. I mean, I'd love to hear just from you the same question, last question you asked me in terms of insights. You work with a lot of amazing organizations. You're, out there facing the market just like I am. I'd love to hear your take on some of those things.
I think from my perspective, a lot of the recruiting that I do tends to be much more technical and much more tactical in nature, right? We're really trying to dig up talent that is passive and present opportunities and evaluate the talent for their scientific rigor and their scientific experience or their clinical experience, medical experience. And for the roles that I'm focused on, which are typically director level, VP level, maybe even C-level roles, so we'll call it leadership and executive level roles, I would say clients are being a little bit more selective now because they can be more selective. And it still is competitive from a candidate's perspective. I mean, because there's more talent who is available and interested on the market, and because people are maybe a little bit more open to hearing about new opportunities because of the financial landscape across the industry. Um,
Right.
it's because I think the competition is more on the candidate side than on the company side. That's kind of what I'm seeing.
Right.
However, I will say a lot of the best candidates that I'm working with will have multiple opportunities. And going back to your point, and multiple, I'm not saying like 5 or 6 offers, they might have 1 or 2 other opportunities. The best ones, for whatever reason, always seem to have multiple opportunities. Um, and I will say compensation, of course, is always a factor, but I've actually been surprised, to your point, how much that's not the main factor, right? I think 10, 15, 20 years ago, that was, like you said, compensation is king. And now it's kind of like they almost know what they're going to get paid walking into the door.
Right.
Every
Right.
the lanes, if you will, have been. I'll give the industry credit there. They've done a really nice job of putting barriers and targets in place, so the ranges aren't that different from one
Right.
company to another. They really aren't. Um, Although I will say a couple of years ago, we were seeing different ranges, and I think it's kind of leveled out a little bit because
Agreed.
I think it's judicious, and I think it's financially responsible for companies to do that. And I think, to your point, companies have through just general competition have kind of figured out what everyone else is paying. They've come to a level for each particular level of experience, and they are battling using ethos, and they are battling using culture, and they are battling using flexibility and taking into account work-life balance and people's wellness. And what I also have seen is companies who are maybe implementing more rigid surveillance measures, we'll call them. I hate that word, but those companies, they might have to revert back to a more flexible model. Um, so those are just some raw thoughts off the top of my mind.
Yeah,
What I'm seeing.
absolutely. I agree with all of those, and also the flexibility piece is interesting because I've really seen a big push for return to work.
Yeah,
What would have been a remote role a year and a half ago was probably a hybrid role. What would have been a hybrid role before is a full back in office 5 days a week role,
yeah,
right? People were allowing folks to not relocate but to commute from state to state, and I'm seeing a harder line drawn on. No, we actually need you to be local. So I'm really interested to see how that manifests over the next 12 to 24 months and what that means for candidates in terms of a shift in psyche, right?
yeah. That's an that's an active battle that we're in the middle of that right now,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
I've seen a lot of requests that, like you said, a year or two ago, would be like, nope, they're fully remote, and now it's like, well, we want them on site 2 or 3 days a week.
right,
Which, if they live in a different state, that can't happen.
right,
So
right.
it's changing things up. So we'll see where it's going to end up, somewhere in the middle, like most things do, or maybe it won't. But we will find out that there will be some sort of middle ground. And it seems like, if I were to make a prediction, it's going to be, depending on the skill set, depending on the level, it's going to be some sort of hybrid situation. But there might be more, some of those candidates that live out of life sciences hubs may have
Mm-hmm.
to move, or
Right,
might have to be more willing to travel, multiple times a month to land their
exactly,
gigs.
exactly.
So that's going to be.
We'll see. We shall
We
see.
shall see. It's evolving, and that's an active battleground as we speak. So we'll see what happens. Cool.
Well, good.
Last question for you: if you were to give anyone advice who was
Yes.
either looking to grow their career in talent acquisition,
Mm-hmm.
or somebody who is entering the talent acquisition field, what would you say?
Grab your helmet. No, I would say surround yourself with people who you can identify work the way you want to be able to work, right? If you don't know what you're doing yet, or you know a little bit, What served me best was surrounding myself with leaders and colleagues that knew more than me, did things differently than I did. Because talent acquisition can be a lonely place to be if you try and grow yourself up inside of it. There's a lot to learn from the people around us. There are a lot of really smart people who have learned things over the years, and maybe you can save yourself a little headache if you kind of look around you, right? Not just straightforward.
Right.
So I think that'd be my biggest piece of advice.
I think that's a perfect piece of advice, and it's so simple, but it's so impactful. I've always told everybody, almost everything I've ever learned has been from those around me, or from making a couple bad mistakes and then learning the hard way.
Exactly.
So
exactly, probably a blend of both. But if you can,
Right.
avoid the latter, even better.
Yeah,
Even better.
yeah. You can't learn this role out of a textbook,
No,
or this job, or this field, if you will. So
exactly.
awesome.
Agreed.
Well, Amy, this was fantastic. I know we've been planning this for quite some time, and
Yes.
I really enjoyed this. So thank you so much for being a guest.
It was wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. We'll have to do it again.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Talent Therapy Podcast with Chris Tamburini. This show is for entertainment purposes only and is copywritten by Rana and Vance, LLC.